Salutations. I make this fireside address to be directed at anyone who is involved with MAGA, QAnon, and Republican Party in general. However, as my subscriber base is majority anti-imperialists and traditional leftists, they are most welcome to take instruction relative to the input that I'm about to offer here. As a point of reference, I'm going to bring up the South Park episode, Emo Kids. In the Emo Kids episode, the hardcore Marilyn Manson listening, cigarette smoking, beer drinking goth kids are conflated with the trendy and popular emo kids, to the irritation of the goth kids. The goth kids retaliate against the emo kids by kidnapping the leader of the emo kids and shipping him off to the middle of nowhere, and then they proceed to burn down the Hot Topic at the local South Park shopping mall, where all the popular emo kids buy their trendy pop culture emo clothing, and then hold a school assembly at the end of the episode to educate the kids at South Park Elementary the difference between the goth kids and the emo kids. We have a similar situation in real life relative to what is happening within the left. The MAGA and Q crowd go to great lengths to attack the left, which they perceive as a bunch of AOC-supporting Marxists who want basic income and who want to terrorize Trump supporters for the sake of them being Trump supporters. The antagonism that the MAGA crowd feels towards what they perceive as the left is very well justified. These kids running around today call themselves leftists, are more militant, socially liberal, woke evangelicals who act outraged at every single thing they perceive to be injustice and often go to excessive lengths to prove how down with the struggle they are relative to anti-racism, anti-sexism, and environmentalism, being hyper-paranoid about climate change, without realizing that they are merely following a corporatized trend that uses social justice as a means to sell product and appeal to folks who have been historically marginalized and exploited by the very corporate institutions that push woke and cancel culture as both a marketing strategy and as an Orwellian social programming mechanism to suppress anti-corporate dissent under the guise of social justice. The left that the conservative crowd attacks is what many of us traditional leftists term as the synthetic left, whereas I refer to this group as the Postmodern-Left. And they are effectively the emo kids in the South Park episode that I referenced, and who consider the goth kids, us, the traditional leftists, to be right-wing, even though there would be no emo culture without these anti-establishment goths. They are left not because they are truly left, but because it's trendy and it's a corporate pop culture fad, which directly contradicts the anti-corporate message of the traditional left. And thus, we have a schism within the left over this present state of affairs in 2022. In response to the anti-1% Occupy movement that came about 10 years ago, and you can see where I'm standing, this is sort of like my alternative home base, Zuccotti Park. Corporations, universities, and nonprofits worked overdrive to cut down the traditional left, which provided a threat to the profit motives of big pharma, big tech, and big finance, and NATO, which the Occupy movement, despite this belief from the Fox News watching crowd that we were supposedly working for George Soros, when we were not, at least not most of us anyway, and posed a direct threat to as far as Wall Street and London were concerned. Instead of the original 99% versus 1% message pitting all people against the corporations and the military-industrial complex, cultural Marxism instead was pushed in the form of identity politics, critical race theory, intersectional theory, pitting the 99% against the 99% in the form of racial and sexual divisions over deliberately exaggerated notions that the United States is entirely a white supremacist country, and that cultural racism was a bigger problem to the United States than, say, mass privatization and endless wars. Shortly after Occupy, Black Lives Matter became an organic proletarian struggle against police brutality at the behest of the real estate industry, coaxing police to terrorize black inner-city communities as a means to push them out so they can be replaced with liberals who condemn white supremacy despite being the very beneficiaries of systemic racism. The 1% corporatists and George Soros would silence and neutralize the radical elements of Black Lives Matter and buy off the more moderate leaders like Patty Cullors, who's a trained Marxist, as a means to push the Democratic Party agenda, which raises boatloads of capital whenever there's an episode of police misconduct occurring, whether it is deliberately or inadvertently. Which brings us to where we are today, and the great schism within the left, between the traditionalists and the postmodernists. MAGA and Q have a tendency to generalize the left as one cohesive, unified, collective mass attempting to bring down the United States as a means to usher in globalist control, in which they perceive the bourgeois, the enemies of the traditional left, Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, Prince Charles, George Soros, the Rockefeller family, and the Rothschild family, as part of some secret satanic cabal that wants to monopolize the world's resources in the name of socialism. Never mind the fact that they are openly associated with a $10 trillion nonprofit organization called the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism. And never mind the fact that George Soros, on his own website, which is Open Societies Foundation, openly brags about the fact that he helped to bring down the Soviet Union by financially backing Lech Walesa and the anti-Soviet Polish Solidarity movement back in 1989. And this is why it is important for the MAGA and Q crowd to understand the difference between the traditional left and the postmodern left. The postmodern left is typically characterized by their tendencies toward anti-authoritarianism. Typically, they read a book called Settlers by some questionable author named Jay Sakai, which makes the argument that all white people are evil, even if they are working class. They also read Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals and Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. They do not support Russia. They believe Vladimir Putin is the second coming of Hitler, even though that's more like Zelensky who is. They do not support the Communist Party of China, nor do they support Xi Jinping. They say free Taiwan, free Hong Kong, and err more so towards the Dalai Lama and the Free Tibet movement than they do Mao Zedong. Although some of them call themselves Maoists without ever actually having read Mao. They are in favor of NATO intervention in Syria as a means to remove who they perceive as the authoritarian Bashar al-Assad. Yeah, they basically embrace the Bush doctrine with woke characteristics. The postmodern left goes to great lengths to brand the traditional left as white supremacists, conspiracy theorists, and fascists for talking about class and scientific Marxism and criticizing NATO instead of talking about critical race theory, genderqueer theory, sexual liberation, and being out of line with the narrative that the mainstream liberal establishment puts out. Postmodern leftists cling to AOC, Bernie Sanders, and the Squad and demand basic income from the corporations they are supposed to not reform, but to bring down. They often appear as non-binary, trans, and woke, and they will attend every protest the Democratic Party organizes dressed up as Antifa as a means to terrorize middle America into voting for the Democratic Party line, who does not do the bidding of China. And I will repeat that. Who does not do the bidding of China, but the bidding of Wall Street, London, and Switzerland. The Democratic Party is effectively the party of Bush and Reagan. But instead of hiding behind the flag and Christianity, they hide behind the rainbow flag and social liberalism on crack. All right? The postmodern left raised no issue whatsoever to Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos using the pandemic as a means to engage in crisis profiteering, manipulating government policy to shut down 200,000 small businesses and throw 50 million people out of work so the 1% could use a government bailout to give themselves $2 trillion in the form of the CARES Act funding and make an extra $3 trillion on top of, from killing off their small business competitors, and instead shamed people for not staying home, not getting vaccinated, and for being selfish. The postmodern left dutifully follows the dictums of the 1%, even though they believe they're fighting the establishment when they do the establishment's bidding. The traditional left, who the liberals brand as right-wing conspiracy theorists, even though we are literally the left, are the folks who uphold Vladimir Putin, uphold Communist Party China and Xi Jinping, and are anti-NATO intervention in every circumstance, and in fact, want NATO dissolved and disbanded outright. Traditional leftists cannot stand AOC, Bernie, and the squad, with the view that they are controlled opposition, which they are, to sheepdog kids into voting for counter-revolutionary pro-corporate Democrats. The traditional left rejects Obama, Pelosi, Clinton, Kamala Harris, and Biden because they're not communists, in so much believing that they work on behalf of the interest of neoconservatives, Bush and Reagan, and the traditional left. You know what? They do uphold Mao and Stalin, where the postmodern left outright rejects Stalin and calls him right-wing, and nominally supports Mao Zedong without understanding anything about Mao Zedong thought. In fact, Mao Zedong himself said that only the bourgeois globalist whites were the enemies of African Americans and not working class and middle class whites. And this passage is in the Little Red Book of Mao Zedong's quotes. In addition to upholding the American Revolution against the Crown, Abraham Lincoln, ending slavery, the two Roosevelts, and America's tradition of historical progress, whereas the postmodern left does not in any way whatsoever. In the past, we are talking 10, 20 years ago, the traditional left has marched in solidarity with the LGBTQ community and African American communities. You know, I marched in Newark 10 years ago during Trayvon Martin's, or I should say the George Zimmerman trial. I didn't march with Black Lives Matter. I marched with the Nation of Islam. All right? And they still address me as comrade when I go to Newark, by the way. And we did this long before it became trendy and corporatized, when demonstrations were small, organic, and, not mainstream. The traditional left, like MAGA and Q, has animus towards multinational corporate conglomerates and combinations. Not because we think they're a satanic cabal, even though they are pretty satanic, we're not going to lie, but because they are ruthless capitalist entities that engage in wage exploitation, union busting, and facilitate the practice of human trafficking to undercut wages and maximize their profits. The traditional left rejects cultural Marxism. We do. And we also reject wokeness, with the view that cultural Marxism is not scientific and instead echoes the race science that was promulgated by early 20th century eugenicists, except with an inverted twist. Instead of white supremacy, it's non-white supremacy, but it's supremacy nonetheless. The traditional left believes in the development of nuclear fusion technology, the development of high-speed railroads, and improving the lives of American citizenry, versus the postmodern left that wants to tear everything down and go back to zero, following orders from their general Greta Thunberg as a way to help Mother Earth heal. The traditional left believes that the working class should be armed to protect themselves from the capitalist oligarchs, whereas the postmodern left believes in disarming the populace so the globalists can impose their will on the American working class and middle class. The traditional left focuses on deteriorating material conditions that affect everyone, whereas the postmodern left focuses on cultural wedge issues at the beck and whim of the Democratic Party. Finally, the traditional left endorses the idea of a proactive government that works to break up big tech and big finance and throw corrupt financial actors like Bill Gates into prison, impose price controls to regulate the anarchy of the free market as a means to stifle inflation and price gouging, and put productive forces and natural resources under public ownership to prevent Bill Gates and Disney from monopolizing our commons for profit. Essentially, the traditional left is not wild about Donald Trump. Honestly, we're not, and we find him kind of annoying sometimes, but we don't think he's the devil. But we are tolerant so much that Trump made friendly overtures to North Korea, and we feel the frustration that the MAGA crowd has at the postmodern left, and with endless wars and the corporatocracy, whereas the postmodern left calls us conspiracy theorists for being against corporatocracy and endless wars, and that's why we hate them. And you know what? The postmodern left also hates everything and anything that Trump stands for, as they are the foot soldiers of the Democratic Party and monopoly capitalist establishment. Where the confusion comes within the MAGA and Q crowd is how they are being deliberately misled by neoconservatives. And Dinesh D'Souza, who may have been right about 2,000 mules, but who is wrong about everything else, part of the Heritage Foundation, and someone who acted as George W. Bush's chief propagandist for the Iraq War, is one of the biggest offenders. That the postmodern left and the traditional left are the same? No, we're not. And he and others like him, like Ben Shapiro, do this on purpose to discourage MAGA and Q from working with the traditional left, who agrees with MAGA about 70% of the time, with disputes over the question of centralization versus decentralization, abortion rights, and the subject of taxation in general. Since the 1950s, the monarchist-friendly, British Empire-friendly, Rothschild-friendly neocons like Dinesh D'Souza have used deep state propaganda to endlessly demonize Marxism as a means to convince Americans that those who try to organize the working class against the globalist elite are their enemy, and that globalist royal elites are their friends, even though the United States was founded in a revolution not against Marxism, but royalty. Socialism is not the enemy of the United States, more so as it is the enemy of the British Crown, which for the past 1,000 years have made endless attempts to establish global dominance by the point of the musket and bayonet, until socialist regimes like in China, the USSR, and Cuba were formed to kick the globalist royals out of their countries to prevent foreign exploitation of their people and foreign seizure of their natural resources, from which the crown can profit from. The United States has been the dumb muscle of the very perverse influence that they supposedly declared their independence from in 1776, spending trillions of dollars to stop the spread of communism, to protect the profit motive of the economically liberal British nobility and their economically liberal adjacent aristocracy, which seeks to erase all the borders and form a one-world government where royalty and aristocracy still exists. That doesn't sound like socialism, does it? This is not saying that MAGA and Q do not have to change their ways and become socialists all of a sudden. We of the traditional left do not expect that, but we ask of them to have a more nuanced position relative to socialism and respect the right of peoples in foreign states, should they choose to live in socialist states, which are economically strangled by of imports and trade, because they refuse to yield to the globalists' desire to monopolize the resources. And we ask them to be more hostile relative to challenging European royalty and European aristocracies, which have been attempting to colonize and monopolize the productive forces of the planet since the time of the Crusades over 1,000 years ago, and have profited and continue to profit from these unholy endeavors to keep the royals rich. We also ask of MAGA and Q to please stop conflating the traditional left, you know, the goths, with the postmodern left, you know, the emos. We are not the same, and we are nothing alike. And when they attack the left, to call them the postmodern left instead, who we, as traditional leftists, are just as annoyed with and pestered by as the MAGA and Q crowd are. We also ask MAGA and Q to tone down the xenophobia. We understand you don't care for how Communist Party China runs their country, But we ask you to understand that the crown for the past 200 years has been attempting to penetrate into Asian markets, and China does not want the crown to rule them, no more than we want the crown to rule our country. World War III over Taiwan is not worth advocating when the question between mainland China and Taiwan is strictly between mainland China and Taiwan. Absent of Western interference, by the way. We of the traditional left are willing to help MAGA and Q in their struggle against the rhinos and neocons infesting the GOP, as we have been at war with rhinos and neocons for the past 50 years, and we are willing to meet halfway with the MAGA and Q crowd when it comes to bringing down the globalist menace and the unholy trinity of Davos, the Vatican, and the City of London, attempting to destroy our republic and crush the experiment of the American Revolution. In closing, while we have disagreements over the question of centralization versus decentralization, MAGA and Q, we of the traditional left, are not your enemies. You are our fellow citizens, and while we may not agree with everything that you say, we will defend to the death your right to say what you will, so long as you are willing to engage in non-slanderous discourse relative to our economic position and economic theories. We aren't Satanists, we aren't part of the cabal, we don't subscribe to cultural Marxism, and honestly, while I am more on the secular side of things, there are many of us within our ranks who are Christians and who are also socialists at the same time. It's true. Look at Caleb Maupin. In addition to that, we are willing to moderate our position, knowing that you will not meet us quite at Mao or Stalin, unless you're a legitimately white supremacist or a psycho-liberal, then maybe we will, and instead meet you folks halfway at Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt. Our country is in serious trouble right now, and we see you, we hear you, and we're on your side, even though you constantly demonize us and conflate us with the postmodern left, who we have nothing in common with. It's time to end the polarization of the left and the right, and it's time to come into the center, and together as Americans who will band together to save our country from Davos, Switzerland, and the crown. And not to make America great again, but to make America even greater. God save our American states. Down with the crown. This is Comrade Pella, signing out.